Okay. So thank you, Professor Kaviraj, for agreeing to speak to my students primarily, and invited some of your students and friends to this class as well. So I welcome you to speak on the idea of self in Tagore and Gandhi, and you may probably take 1 hour, then we'll have a longer discussion. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Arun, thank you. As usual, I think we should dispense with the Indian convention of long introduction because the introductions are paradoxical because somebody might have been good at the past, but that does not mean that he is still good in the present. And anyway, so what I shall do is, uh, I find the question of the self very intriguing because um, there are two sides which are very interesting for me in thinking about the self. One is the concept itself, that is, uh, why do we use the term self rather than the term I or me? Uh, and secondly, uh, we shall also see that uh, self is um, always always presented in the world, both in the singular and the plural. And one of the major questions of thinking about the singular self is that if you think of the singular self in a particular way, if you think of you yourself in a particular way, then the we to which you belong, and we always belong to multiple plural selves. We might belong to the we of the Bengalis or Orias. We can belong to the we of the Indians. We can belong to the we of the Asians. We can belong to the we of the Hindus, Muslims, etc. So I think philosophically, the question of the we, the question of the self is very important because of this, because there are many, many uh, difficult, to my mind, in some senses, even today, uh, in terms of the sociological self, unsolved questions that exist about thinking about the self. So this is one side of the question, which I would not deal with today. But I'm mentioning this for those of you who are students and want to think about this question. You must realize that if you really want to think well about three questions, which must be central to your mind. How does Gandhi think about the self? Why did he do that? How did Tagore think about the self? And the third question, which is always folded into these, our asking of these questions themselves, is uh, why do I read Gandhi thinking about the self or Tagore if it is not something through which I equip myself with uh, arguments of different kinds so that I can eventually develop a way of thinking about myself or yourself, right, which is richer than what we have today. So that is how I look at the question of the self and the question, why should I? Whenever we take up a question, we must ask the question, why do I take up this question? Or what would have been lost if I didn't take up the question at all? So that's why I think the question of the self is so important. And when Arun asked me, I readily agreed because whenever I teach the theory and methods course, where we have to discuss identity or Indian political thought or Western political thought, the question of the self actually looms very large in all these discussions. So let me make just a very few quick points about the self in the abstract. And then I shall take up first, uh, I think I'll first take up Tagore's conception of the self on the basis of the poem that I sent you, because I hope to be able to show you that that poem is an extraordinarily useful tool in a certain sense to think about this question philosophically. And then I shall go to Gandhi's conception of the self, because that would also raise some very important issues. So, the self, the first point that I want to make here uh, tersely, but I shall come back to it later when we discuss Gandhi. First, you must give attention to the word itself, self, and the two other words, which are always adjacent to the self, the English term I, Bengali term for me would be Ami, Hindi term would be मैं, and we also have another term, me, which serves the same kind of purpose. So the first question is to ask, why do we have a surplus word? Why isn't the word I sufficient to do the functions of the word self? So there must be something that the word self is able to do, which the word I cannot. What is that? I think it's a very important philosophical point, and it would be crucial in my elaboration of the Gandhian thinking of the self. The self is not an entity. The self is a relation. Uh, what is the self? When I want to point to the I, when I want to point to me, I have to use the term self, right? So self, the term self, the word self itself, is by definition, from the start, always a reflexive relation. And reflexive means two things. I must have an awareness that I exist. Without that, I cannot even begin to be reflexive. And the second, I must be aware that I do not merely exist. At this particular moment in time, on this particular logical occasion, when we are thinking about the self, I am trying to think about myself. And as you can see, there are many, many interesting complications of this. That is, can I observe myself when a dancer dances on the stage? And um, she's a very fastidious dancer. She wants to improve her dancing all the time. She would benefit if she could divide half of herself and put that half in front of herself, and one half observes and the other half dances, right? Then of course she would be able to improve her dance, but it's not easy. So, but what I mean is that whenever we use the term self, it involves this dual awareness, the awareness of myself, I exist, the awareness of the I, and also the awareness that it's the I who is trying to think about the I. That is the notion of the self, and therefore the self is always hidden. I wanted to make a couple of points very quickly, and then go into Tagore. Professor Amartya Sen has a book called Identity and God. And in the early part of that book, he makes a remark with which I have some disagreement. I think the disagreement is not substantive. The disagreement is essentially semantic. But I think the semantic disagreement is important for me. He says, to put it very uh, briefly, his entire book is premised on the idea that I have many identities. We are shifting a little bit from the term self to the term identity. So he says that I have many identities. So in my case, I have an identity as uh, as a male. I have an identity as a university teacher. I have an identity as a Bengali, as an Indian. Many different identities in his language. I totally agree with what he is trying to capture and where he wants to go with that in that book. Although I think even in the conclusion could be conceptually more elaborated. But I do not, I'm not happy with the use of the term identities in the plural. Uh, I want to use the term identity in the singular to indicate the collection of these features. I'll call these attributes. My Bengaliness is an attribute, my maleness is an attribute, my university professorness is an attribute. So these are all attributes. So I would say that my identity is the contingent combination of all these attributes at this moment in time, right? Why do I say contingent? Because I can acquire new attributes. When I was in JNU, I did not have the attribute of, living abroad, being, being being expatriate in a certain sense, living in a which I have acquired, and therefore, there's some attributes that we can drop as well. And secondly, my relationship with one of my attributes can also change over time. So at this point, I'm not a very religious person. So you cannot say that I'm intensely Hindu person. But if tomorrow I decide that I should go with the BJP and become the BJP supporter, right? Then an attribute which is possibly latent in me is brought forward, intensified, etc. So my way of looking at this question changes the semantics a little bit. I don't call these my identities. I call these my identity attributes, right? And if you say that these are attributes, in one of my papers I have said that these are like adjectives, right? Different qualities which every individual carries in herself. But if you think of these as attributes, simply on the basis of what I said just now, that I can intensify my hinduism, I can intensify my leftism, I can decrease or fade my leftism. So these are things that I can foreground or fade, intensify or de-intensify, right? I can add new attributes, I can drop attributes. So that actually shows to me that we cannot do simply with an adjective like thinking about identity. We must also have a verb like thinking about identity, right? So when Bengalis are saying in 1947 that the most important thing is that we are Muslims and therefore we should uh, become part of East Pakistan. I'm now shifting from an individual to a collective. They emphasize they are Muslims, right? In 71, when they demand the separate Bengali state, their Muslimness uh, has not evaporated. But what they have done is they have foregrounded their Bengaliness, and given it priority over their Muslim. So this kind of activity with your attributes. So what I'm saying is that if you think of attributes like adjectives, we must also posit something like a verb, like a function, a capacity in myself through which I choose, which attributes are significant in my understanding of myself, right? So self-making is this verb which operates on the attributes of our identity, right? So that is the activity of the self. So I argue, therefore, that there's a distinction between identity attributes and identity function. So one is adjective like, and the other one is verb like. So let me stop with the discussion here. Also, with another warning, um, you should not get the impression from what I said just now that my identity consists only of what I think I am. That's a very important part of my identity. But identity in society, when we do political sociology, cannot be just what I think I am. Because my identity in social life is also how other people see me. That is what others think I am. So therefore, as one of my colleagues, Akhil Bikrami, has an interesting paper in which he says that we must make a distinguish between a first person identity, my thinking on uh, my thinking of what I am, and a third person identity, that is somebody else who is an ordinary member of the society in which I live, would consider me to be, right? What kind of person he would consider me to be. To give you an interesting example, if when I lived in England, and an ordinary, not highly educated, but an ordinary Britisher would see me as an Indian, he would sociologically generalize and say that, well, most probably this man has a corner shop because there are hundreds and thousands of Gujarati corner shops. So that is what Indians are associated with. When somebody sees me in America as an Indian, they sociologically think that I must be in software. or something like that, because Indians are generally associated with the software industry. So this is an example of the third person understanding of your identity. And in social life, your identity is always a kind of fraught, dynamic, constantly changing interface between what you think you are and what others think you are. So that is actually the sociological problem of the shaping of the self, making of the self, carrying the self. Let me now turn to the question of the self in Tagore and Gandhi. I'll start with Tagore. I circulated a poem by Tagore. Tagore has three uh, very interesting poems in terms of the title. He has two poems, both of which are called Ami. And there is one poem called Ami, which he included in his own collection of his poetry called Sanchoita. So that is actually very, very well known. That's not the poem that I'm giving. That is also called Ami. And if you're curious, you could um, look at that poem. That poem is concerned with something else. That poem is concerned with the, um, you know, the problem of how the self posits the world and questions of that kind. This one, because it's not part of Sanchoita, is less well known, but I think it's a more important point to understand the philosophical question of the self. And then there's a very, very early poem by Tagore when he's really a very young man, which also has an intriguing title of somebody at that age, which is Ami Hara. You know, Hara is somebody who has lost something. You know, that is Hara. So Ami Hara, hard to translate in a single English word. It can be I hyphen less, that is one who has lost himself. So my own understanding is that Tagore thought about the question of the self all his life in various ways and increasingly deeply. Um, but I think I get a philosophical bit in a quite consistently presented, almost rigorously presented philosophical picture of the notion of self in this particular poem. So let me read the poem with you. The first stanza is a question. It says, আজ ভাবি মনে মনে তাহারে কি জানি, যাহার বলায় মোর বাণী, যাহার চলায় মোর চলা, যাহার ছবিতে মোর কলা, etc. etc. That is, do I know this person uh, who speaks in my speech, who's, who paints in my art, and who essentially lives this life of mine? Um, do I know this person? Arun, there's a constant ringing of a bell. I don't know why. Anyway, I don't know if it's a notification coming on my computer.
No,
I
no.
think when people are joining,
They're
people
joining.
are joining and leaving, that's
Oh,
what
I
the
see.
sound they're making.
Okay, that's okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So the first stanza is a question. আজ ভাবি মনে মনে তাহারে কি জানি, যাহার চলায় মোর চলা, etc. So moves in my movement, writes in my writing, etc. Do I know him? You know, I have also become, over the last 15, 20 years, more and more of an extremist in interpretation, essentially under the influence of ancient Indian philosophers. You know, if you read somebody like Abhinavagupta, reading a poem, uh, he's just an absurdly extremist commentator. He would say that even if you have a term like he, indeed, or ever, or something like that, you know, normally because poetry, particularly because it's written in verse, we assume that there's a lot of fillers there in order to make the words rhyme or something like that. But Abhinava says that when you are reading a great figure, never do that. Take every single word and try to read that word. Read meaning, try to put different types of meanings onto that word and then see how putting meaning on that word changes the meaning of the sentence in different ways. So I would not do that with you today, but if I write, I'll write it in Bangla. The first word, Aaj bhabi mone mone. I think today is also quite interesting, because this is something you can read it in two different ways. One is that, as experience accumulates for ourselves, it also creates a pressure for reflexivity. That I accumulate experiences of grief, let us say. There are different things which cause sorrow to my mind. But sometimes I feel an episode of sorrow, which is deep. And then it triggers the thought in my mind that, let me try to understand what this is. And then I actually go back and try to string together all the experiences of grief that I have experienced in my life and try to think about it. Or Aj might also say that, we are sometimes actually put into it not by the pressure of experience. The last argument is pressure of experience. So experience accumulates. So one experience attaches to the next and accumulates and creates the pressure for self-understanding. Aj can also mean that something suddenly has happened so that it triggers this question in my mind. But anyway, the question is, do I know this person whom I call I? So it's a typical presentation of the question of the self. Now, the next stanza is the technical, philosophical, individualistic. I would use the term from Macpherson's title, The Political Theory of Positive Individualism. The first answer is a positive individualistic answer to this question, who am I? Or who is this I who lives through me? So the second stanza says, "Bhebechinu amate se বাঁধা." I thought that this I was bound to me. In Bengali, "বাঁধা" is a wonderful word. So "বাঁধা" can mean it's arrested, it cannot go anywhere else. "বাঁধা" can mean anchored. But here, "বাঁধা" actually means bounded. Both tied to in the sense of being bounded. The boundedness is a very important thing, as we shall see. ভেবেছিল আমাকে সে বাঁধা, এই প্রাণের, that is of my life, যত হাসা কাঁদা, that is all the experience of happiness and sorrow that I have had. এই প্রাণের যত হাসা কাঁদা, গণ্ডি দিয়ে মোর মাঝে, গণ্ডি is a boundary. The Lakshman Rekha is a Gandhi. It's called a Gandhi. The Sita had stepped out of the Gandhi, right? And that's why she could be taken away by Rama. So, গণ্ডি দিয়ে মোর মাঝে, বেঁধেছে তাহারে মোর সকল খেলায় সব কাজ. That is, by creating a boundary, it has gathered, বেঁধেছে, again, observe that verb, বেঁধেছে. We saw that in the previous stanza, বাঁধা, ভেবেছিল আমাকে সে বাঁধা, বেঁধেছে আমার তাহারে মোর সকল খেলায় সব কাজ. So, he has been tied to my life. So it's both tied and bounded, but গণ্ডি দিয়ে, that is, by creating boundary, সকল খেলায় সব কাজ. And then you have two shattering lines. ভেবেছিল সে আমারই আমি. That is, I thought that it was my I. It's difficult to translate into English, but I'm sure those of you who know Indian vernacular, you would instantly understand this. It would be something like, I don't know if there's a Hindi speaker here, Mera Mai or Meri Mai or something like that. ভেবেছিল সে আমারই আমি. আমার জনম হবে, আমার মরণে যাবে থাম. So it started with my birth and it will end with my death, right? So this is the meaning of the Gandhi. And so this is the I, which resides in me, this is myself. And then in the next few stanzas, there are two separate answers. Um, the fact that he does not find this satisfactory is not presented in a querulous form. So you don't have a stanza which actually gives you what Indian philosophers would call a khandana, that is counter-argument, formal counter-argument, saying that this is why the earlier definition of the self is not right. He does not do that. He implies that by the very first sentence, tobe canon, that is then why, right? So in that we can see that he doesn't find it satisfactory. Also, there is something which is very beautiful about Tagore, partly also in Gandhi. There is a comportment of argumentation which is very gentle. And even when he thinks that you are wrong, it's very rarely that he would say that you are wrong. He would say that it's inadequate. And instead of saying that you are wrong, right, to be full in Bangla, he would say, Amar keno mone hai? Why do I think? Right? And I think some of these subtleties, these are not just locutionary subtleties. These are subtleties of argumentative comportment. Just as we have movements of our body, right, which we call comportment. And there are some people who have very civilized comportment, very gentle comportment. And there are some people who have aggressive comportment, right? So, like, there is a kind of tone of writing. And I think in this, we must learn to observe, something which is more than a tone. It is a tone, but it's also a comportment of argumentation. So he then says that I think it's inadequate. And he gives two types of examples. The first, I think, is the most profound example. And he does it much better because he's a poet. So he says, তবে কেন মনে পড়ে নিবিড় হরষে প্রেয়সীর দরসে পরশে বারে বারে অতল মাধুরী সিন্ধু তীরে বারে বারে পেয়েছিনু তারে অতল মাধুরী সিন্ধু তীরে আমার অতীত এ আমি you have got the translation. The translation means but why then তবে কেন মনে পড়ে do I remember নিবিড় হরষে in intense joy or pleasure প্রেয়সী দরসে পরশে, that is when I saw and touched my love or lover অতল মাধুরী সিন্ধু তীরে, that is on the shore of uh, a shore of an ocean, which is otol. Otol means you cannot touch the bottom, the bottomless, ocean of bliss or madhuri or pleasure, happiness, right? অতল মাধুরী সিন্ধু তীরে বারে বারে পেয়েছি তারে আমার অতীত সে আমি. That is why do I feel that I got আমি, I got that me. আমার অতীত সে আমি, got that me, which is beyond me. আমার অতীত, অতীত here does not mean the past. অতীত here means transcending, beyond. আমার অতীত. So if we turn it into our kind of language, language of social philosophy, what does it say? In my reading, that it says, let us go back to the question, who is this I? What is the most important? I'll use a Bengali term, but all of you would understand that in your vernacular. What is the best, the deepest, the most profound parichaya of this I, right? Awareness of this I, or the, it's hard to translate this sense of parichaya. The identity, let's say, of this I. But identity here is identity which is understood by the self and understood by the other. That is parichaya. So he says that if you ask me to define myself, how do I define myself or define my life? Myself or my life is actually defined by the most profound experiences that I have had in my life, right? That is what defines me. And if that is true, that I am defined by the most profound experiences that my life has had, right? Then it follows that the most profound, out of the most profound experiences, he would say probably the most profound experience is the experience of love. And if you accept only this minimal point, right, that you have touched the depths of yourself, right, your own self, means of love, then that means that the earlier definition that we have given, that amateship bandha is bounded in me, it's anchored in me, it is particularly the boundedness that you cannot break the boundary and take an element which is outside this boundary into itself. That argument actually breaks up because then it says, basically, I'll put it very simply. If you want, we can come back to this in the discussion. Basically said that my most profound experiences are impossible for me as a monadic individual, monadic possessive individual to generate, right? So my most profound experiences were those where I was in touch with somebody else. And it is only through the mediation of that somebody else that I was able to experience the most profound experiences of my own life. I want to add a point very quickly. You will see that, Tagore is a Brahmin. He is coming from a Brahmin background. Though he is not a common Brahmin, he is not disdainful about Hindu thinking generally, like the common Brahmin. But he does not draw upon conventional Hindu thinking very often. But I think this is a question on which there's a lot of prior Indian thinking uh, on the Hindu side. Must be also on the Muslim side, I do not know. But especially the Sufis have very, very similar trends of thinking. But um, this is very common in Hindu thought. For instance, if you read the Chaitanya Charitamrita by Krishnadas Kaviraj, the very first, let's say, 10 shlokas, it starts with Sanskrit shlokas. And two or three of the shlokas actually say that God was alone and could not understand his own self, right? Could not taste his own self. The term that is used is aswada. He could not taste his own self. So he creates Radha, in order to taste himself. And then it goes on to say that, in the Kali Yuga, Chaitanya is somebody in whom Radha and Krishna are sublated. And so that is why he is actually Radha Rupa, that is, he is very fair, etc. So he is very beautiful. So that is Radha side. But he might be Radha Rupa, but he is Krishna Swarup. That is his fundamental identity, that he is Krishna. So here also you can see a prior example of this kind of thinking, that the most profound experience of the self can only come through an other, not any other, not any ordinary other, but an other whom you recognize as an I in herself, right? So when I say to me, right, there are two ways of saying to me. One way of saying to me is just uh, is a casual way of saying, right? But the other way of saying to me, which is to me of love, it says that you are also an I, right? But you are an I, which is in a certain sense is present to me, impenetrable to me, because I cannot actually have your experiences. But it is only through you that I can enjoy the experiences which are the most profound for myself, which therefore defines me as who I am. So this is the first argument, that uh, that argument about the self is inadequate because it is individualistic, too individualistic. It's monadic, windowless in that sense. As Leibniz said, a monad is a windowless atom. So it's monadic, and uh, it is possessive. That is, look look at the language of possession in every paragraph. A amari, she amari ami, amar janamabe, amar moranigame, amari ami, the positive case of ami. So, so that is fallacious. And in the next paragraph, I originally did not think of this, but uh, since I've been thinking about this point, because I have to talk to you today, uh, I think I saw something which I did not see very clearly when I wrote that essay, which I must have written, I think, about 20, 25 years back. In order to go to Gandhi, I won't spend much time on this, only to say that um, I think the poem says that there are two ways in which the boundedness of myself is broken. If I think of it closely. One is to intense personal other people and extremely private. And because it is private in this sense, it's an social experience. And there's a very famous poem by Tagore, which I want to use in my Bengali writing, where I should use that. It is an apparently very simple poem about two lovers getting an opportunity because it's a rainy day, so nobody can go out, and therefore uh, the fight in a certain sense because of the rain. But he uses a phrase which I find very powerful. He says, "Jogote keho janu nahi ar." That is as if he's talking about rain, just very heavy rain. But he says, as if there is no one else exists in the whole universe, whole world. Jogote keho janu nahi ar. Now, I think it's a profound sentence because it's a condition of the success of a relationship of love. That when it's very intense, it is unsocial in that sense. That when it reaches great intensity, then it creates a situation where Jogote keho janu nahi ar. You do not need the world, and the world does not exist for you. World meaning any other human being does not exist for you. But that is not the totality of human life. It's equally important to see that myself is created by social identities of different kinds. So if you see the next paragraph, not with the same kind of philosophical clarity, but slightly more vaguely, you have invocation of a community, of a historical community of which you are a part. A community which has actually given you the language to think about your life from the language of Bengali that I use. So the community has given me that language. I did not invent that language. My lover has not given me that language. It's the community which pre-exists, which has given me that language. But when I say that the community has given me that language, in that phrase itself is the idea that it has given me a tool through which I can reflect upon this life. And in reflecting upon this life, the community through its history has also given me great ideas. So you will see that the reference to Sadhoker Itihashe Tari Jyotirmoy Pai Purichaya. That in the life of the great saints, people who have reflected upon the nature of religious life, যুগে যুগে কবির বাণীতে সেই আমি আপনারে পেরেছি জানিতে. In age after age, in the word of the poets, this I, which is not the monadic I, has been able to understand itself. পেরেছে জানিতে. So when I, and I'm not making a metaphorical or excessive claim, because if you read the Bengali stuff that I write, you can say literally that I'm able to understand myself simply by continually plundering the language that has been given to me through Tagore, because he is very near to me. But as I told you, in fact, when I think about Tagore thinking about the self, I think that in Tagore himself, there's a continuity of a certain kind of tradition of this self-other relationship, right? Uh, the I and the other I and you relationship, which comes down from our religious tradition, at least from the Vaishnava time. And I think, Kashmiri Shaivas, some of the Upanishadic writing, they also go into it in great detail. So what do we get in Tagore then himself? He understands very clearly the power of the modern individualistic self. He sets out, again, very clearly with great intellectual clarity, the intellectual justification behind that conception of the self. He says he's not convinced by that. And he then says that an adequate understanding of a human self cannot be positive in that sense, cannot be individualistic in that sense. It has to present, now I'm choosing my words carefully, it has to present sociality, that is social attributes, not individualistic attributes, social attributes inside the self in order to understand and experience the self itself, right? So I can understand, what kind of affection I'm capable of only when I have a child and I interact with the child, right? I can understand what kind of ideas I'm capable of only when I get into a language which to which I'm related like this. And then I start working inside that language, right? So sociality is not just a web of relationships. Now, notice this point of the, because this is the central part of the argument, and then I'll go to Gandhi very quickly. This is that social relations can be seen in two different ways. Individualistically, which means that individuals are prior ontologically, and of course they bear relationships with other individuals in society through commerce, even family. All these are relationships which are set up between individuals, which are prior, right? Which can exist independent of social relations. Tagore is making an argument which I think is very parallel to some passages that you read in Marx, that that is a false way of thinking about the relationship between individuality and sociality. Sociality is something which is pre-exists individual. It's not that the individual pre-exists sociality. Sociality is something which pre-exists individual, both in a structural sense and in a historical sense. And so therefore, a richer, and not just the richer, a more accurate understanding of what our self is would be achieved if we think of these social elements, right, as being inside the individual itself, right, not being brought in from outside and added to it, but something which is internal to the individual. So many of these attributes of sociality are being rendered internal to the individual himself, right? So this is why I think it's such an important point, and it makes such a powerful move. If you read modern social theory, if you read Charles Taylor, for instance, all modern thinkers, or Alexander McIntyre, all modern thinkers who are anti-individualistic, you will find elements of this kind of thinking in them as well. But of course, they draw upon their own traditions, essentially from Aristotle and Christianity, Catholic Christianity in case of McIntyre. In our case, we can draw upon Tagore in our own tradition, but there is a lot of similarity between the critique against the modern individualistic conception of self. Let me now turn to Gandhi very quickly. As you know, Gandhi's writing is paradoxical because every individual passage in Gandhi is very clear. Gandhi is an astonishingly, almost preternaturally clear writer. It's very, very rarely that you might very often say that I do not agree with this. but it's very rarely that he would think, even philosophically, that I do not understand what he's saying. He's very, very clear writer. But at one level, he is also not a very clear writer because he writes very short pieces mostly. In some cases, he has written something like the Swaraj, but most of the time, you do not have a book by Gandhi, which is the length of 200 pages, 300 pages, where he presents a consistent and elaborated out. So that's why what I'm going to do to you now is not to present any particular book or any particular set of articles by Gandhi. What I shall do is I'll simply present to you what I think is a sort of philosophically reconstructed understanding of how Gandhi looks upon the self. Gandhi himself, I think, will say that I get it from the Hindu tradition, which is partly true in the sense that all these elements certainly come from the Hindu tradition. But he's not a very scholastic, pedantic thinker. He's basically interested in the nature of the thought itself rather than where the thought comes from. So what I'm going to present to you is a simple reconstruction of what I think is the best way of understanding how Gandhi thinks about the self. So I'll go back to the point that I started out with. You will see why that is so important. The self is not an entity. The self is a relation. I shall add something else. The self, if you look into philosophical thinking about the self, I do not know about Buddhism very much, but I've been told. But if you look at, let's say, people like Hobbes, there are elements of this kind of argument in them as well, that there's a possibility of saying that the self is not even the totality of my life, the kind of thing that Tagore is talking about. The starts with my life and ends with my death. Some people who have a more extreme philosophical position, they would say that, if you mean by the self something that you feel with great immediacy and intensity, you feel with great intensity because it is immediate. So without a condition of immediacy of experience, you cannot think of the self, right? It's a very plausible argument. But look at the implication of this argument. Implication of this argument, some of these extreme philosophers, Buddhists and some others will say, that in that case, you cannot say that yourself 10 years back is yourself. Your relationship with your experience 10 years back is a faded relation. It's not an immediate relation. If you make immediacy a condition in thinking about yourself, then you have to accept what the Buddhists would call a kind of kshanika, that is momentary. It's at this moment that I feel myself. What's the example? The example, I'll give you a crude example. Suppose I have to go to, one of you has to come to my class, and you have, you know, you have sprained your foot, and you write an email to me saying that, I cannot come to your class today because I have sprained my foot. And I write an email back to you saying that, of course, you don't have to come because of your pain. Now, can you write to me after 6 months, again, when you do not feel like coming to my class? I cannot come to my class because I have sprain in my foot. I would then say to you that, you had pain in your foot 6 months back. It's true that you have a relationship with your pain which no one else can have. But you yourself do not have that relationship with your pain. It's in the past. So Hobbes would say, Hobbes actually faces this very sharply. Hobbes says that it is a memory of your pain. Of course, you have a privileged connection with that memory, right? But you cannot claim that as your experience. There's no immediacy to it, right? If it's an immediacy, it's a memory connected immediacy. There's no physical immediacy to your pain. So some people will say that, think of the self very narrowly as yourself at this particular moment. I'm giving you this example not because I find this completely persuasive. What I'm saying is that when you think of the self as a relation, you can expand that relation. You can also contract that relation, right? It becomes both expandable logically and contractible logically at the same time. So let us see what Gandhi does with that. I think Gandhi's argument is very simple, but also very profound. Think of another saying that I like very much. In a way, he says that people who say that they love humanity do not know what love is. I think it's a very profound idea. And it's linked to what we just read in Tigor. So the argument is like this, in my view, that um, the self is a relation. If the self is a relation, then of course it goes without saying that, I would have the kind of privileged relationship with my bodily self, right? And my individual self, because of obvious reasons, right? But there are many other things in the world with which I can set up a self relation, right? For instance, um, if I go somewhere and I have my grandmother with me, and I'm trying to look for a place for her to sit in the train, which is very crowded, there might be other elderly ladies, but I look for and search for a place only for my grandmother. Why? Because among the elderly ladies of the world, she is related to me through a self relation, right? I can, after securing the seat for my grandmother, if there's another lady standing, I might actually ask the next man to move and ask her to sit. But there is a kind of priority of my relationship with my grandmother, right, which comes from that kind which has that kind of immediacy, which could be overcome, however, but the immediacy uh, should not be denied, ignored, and um, I should acknowledge that, and there is nothing wrong in that. What is wrong is if you feel completely trapped in that and you believe that if the next old lady is being trampled underfoot, you do not care. That would be wrong. But the fact that you have done it for your grandmother is something which comes to you instinctively. But the thing is that if this is true, then we can say that we can set up a self-relation. We do always set up this kind of self-relation in many, many contexts. In some contexts, my family is myself, and the others who are also families. I remember, I recognize that that family is Arun's family, but it's not my family, right? So I have a self-relation. This is no, uh, there is no dishonor to Arun's family in saying that, right? But there is a kind of prioritizing of the relationship with your own family. So I set up this kind of relation with my family, with my village. So, for instance, when I go to Navadvip, where I grew up, uh, I feel a certain relationship with the city. It's my city. I set up a relationship with it. I do not set up the same relationship with Bardhaman, for instance, which is a very similar city. So I can set up that relation with my family, with my larger family, um, with people of my cultural, uh, linguistic community. I say we to the Bengali, which is the setting up of the same kind of relationship. I can do that to the Indian. Then it becomes slightly more problematic, but much more interesting. I can also do that with all other human beings, right? All other sentient beings. I'm becoming a Vaishnava. I do not want to take life away from others. I do not want to kill animals, right? So I cover the animals in this self-relation. I can cover vegetation, all sentient beings under that self-relation. But some philosophers who take more, I would not say extreme, some philosophers who take a strong position on this, they would say that inanimate nature, we can set up a relationship of self-relation with inanimate nature. I'll give you two examples for the inanimate nature argument. The first argument is not a difficult argument. The first argument is that if you ask the question, that at every point when we are extending the self-relation, there's some kind of access or some kind of criterion, some kind of quality which I share with the other, because of which I can extend the self-relation. When I say that I do not want to kill animal as food, uh, obviously I'm saying that, there's a sentience in me, the feeling of pain, which I share with animals, and therefore I should not take away their life, right? So it becomes a difficult question when you come to insentient nature. A stone. Um, One argument would be, there are three arguments which I want you to note. The first argument is that yes, there is a quality which we share, which is the quality of existence. So I exist, the stone also exists. So there is a quality that we share. This is the minimum. Some people would make a slightly more instrumental, not instrumental, slightly different argument and say that, what I consider to be a stone um, is uh, a condition of my life in a certain sense, right? So the water that simply flows past in the river, it is a condition of my life. Without that water, if we subtract the water from the world, I simply would not be able to exist. So it is a condition of my life. But in some philosophical arguments, it's not in Gandhi, but Gandhi comes close to it sometimes. So let me make a final point and then wrap it up. Some religious thinkers will say that think of a situation like this, that you are crossing a huge, you know, desert, to say, on a very hot day, and you are totally parched. You believe that you are going to die. Right? Then you see a stone, right? And you go and take shelter behind that stone. And you stay there till the sun goes down, the earth becomes cooler, and you have revived yourself by that time. And then you can actually walk the rest of the way and get help, and you survive. Right? Now, the stone still remains insentient. Right? The stone hasn't come to life for you. But at the same time, is it not true to say that just as a human being could save your life, the stone has also saved your life? Saying that the stone has saved my life is not an imposture. It is not saying something which is irrational or misleading or wrong. And some philosophers will argue that therefore, when you go past that stone again, because you are a human being, right, the stone doesn't have to have life. But because you are a human being and you have the moral responsibility of moral comportment to things in your life, when you go past that stone, you can actually do a pranam to that stone, right? It does not mean that you are a fool or you do not understand the uh, the real physical nature of the world. But if you do that, it actually shows that the person who says that that's a stone, so why can you feel, how can you feel grateful to the stone? That person does not understand the quality of your humanity, right? We're not talking about the stone, we are talking about you and your relationship with the world. And remember that we started this discussion with the question of the self. So the question of the self is always the question of my relationship with myself, with the I, with the you, with the other you, which surround us in different types of contexts, in different kinds of social action, right? My family, my town or village, my group of people, uh, my nation, humanity, etc. And the final point is that what is the advantage of thinking like this? The advantage of thinking is that you uh, get away from the compulsion of using a finalistic distinction between the self and the other, right? So the self is only my bodily self and my bodily existence and my, corporeal life and everything that corporeal life has, right? Everything else is classified or characterized as the other. Here, otherness and selfness are both provisional and temporary characterization, correct characterization, but provisional and temporary. In one kind of thinking, Arun's family is not my family. So I would not say that his family is my other. It's my non-self in that situation. In another context, when we are traveling together on a holiday, Arun's family is covered by the self-relation with my family, right? So the theoretical point is that if you think like this, then you do not have to think of others as others. You think of others as non-self. So people become non-self under certain circumstances and covered under the self-relation in certain circumstances. These are shifting, changing, right? And um, the most important point is that if you do it that way, then because what to an individualistic way of thinking was an other, and therefore you could visit violence on that or them. If you see it as part of yourself, it becomes very difficult to visit violence on that. Right? And that is why I think there's a deep connection between this kind of thinking and Gandhi's form of nonviolence. That you do not see the Englishman as your other. There's a certain circumstance where the Englishman is facing you with a lathi in hand as a policeman, or an Indian is facing you with a lathi in hand as a policeman. In that limited context, he is your non-self. But you are appealing to him and saying that notice the fact that you are also an Indian. Notice the fact that I'm also a feeling human being. So if you beat me with your lathi, I would feel pain, right? So see the connection between you and me. And so Gandhi's politics, I think, is constantly, trying to play on this relation between the self and the non-self. And where somebody says that, well, you are my other, you are my non-self, and I can visit violence from you. He's saying that, no, you are not my non-self in every sense. You are my non-self in a narrow sense. But I precisely want to overcome that and show to myself and also to you that there's a context in which you are only my non-self and therefore can be covered with a self-relation if you change the context a little bit. And therefore, he would appeal to the Englishman and say that you should see the injustice of colonialism. You do not want to be colonized. So how can you want other people to be colonized if you do not want to be colonized yourself, right? Look at the appeal in this. The ethical appeal is always an ethical appeal of this kind, that something which was seen as self and other is broken down. And the person who was considered to be another is now shown under a different definition, a different logical description, to be part of a larger self, which then makes it possible for you to have a dialogue with each other. And I'll finish by an example, extraordinary example. I do not know what to do with it. There's several times that Gandhi wrote a letter to Hitler. Several times he wrote a letter to Hitler. And the only way in which you can make sense of it, because he's an intensely serious person, he's not somebody who's frivolous. And the only way in which you can make sense of that is to go back to this kind of conception of the self. That there is a certain point where even to people who are doing the most outrageous, obnoxious things, you must appeal to them to see the connection between you and them. But appeal does not mean that you lie down. No, that's, I think, the important thing about Gandhi. He's never saying that you lie down to, but appeal to him in the sense that, you are saying that you alter your understanding of yourself. And then you will see that we have a connection. So I personally feel that, the concept of the self is very profound. Without having a concept of the self, we cannot deal with society. We simply cannot live a social human life. That's why it's important to think about self. The literature on the self, I think, is not very highly developed. The philosophical literature is very highly developed on the analytical side, on questions like, future self, later self, this kind of thing. There's a lot of Oxford philosophers writing on this, Derek Parfit and others. Bernard Williams. aside of the social self with which we deal all the time as students of politics and society, I don't think the academic literature on the self is very highly developed. So it's an absolutely profound question. It's a question on which I think Indian thinkers, because they do not buy into the positive individualistic modern Western notion so easily, partly because of the question of colonialism and resistance to the dominance of European thought. They, I think in a highly original, interesting, and critical way. And I think to have a critical orientation towards uh, that kind of liberal individualistic thought, either from a Hegelian perspective or communitarian perspective, like Taylor and McIntyre, or McIntyre, right? You will saying that they are the same positive individualistic notion of the self and how it does not work. And it does not actually lead to a fulfilled human life. And therefore, I think the two people you have chosen to think about now are very good at that. They do not think identically, but I think there's a great deal of overlap between the thinking in Gandhi and Tagore. Tagore is an aesthetic thinker primarily, and his focus is of nature, things, etc. Gandhi is not a very aesthetically oriented thinker. He's a deeply ethically oriented thinker. But the fact that they were so friendly to each other uh, is also very interesting. They were friendly in a very self-possessed and self-respecting way that they appreciated the other's argument, but didn't always accept. So that's why I think if you the temptation, there's no Indian thinking in that sense. And the value of is look at what they say closely and then think with that, push beyond the point where they stop. I think we can right here, in this concept. Thank you. I'm finished, Arun.
Okay. Thank you, Sudipta, but I could not hear your last bit. You can probably come back to question answer. It's very
Which
stimulating.
one?
Like last bit of your presentation, I could not hear. There was a lot of interruptions
No, I see.
in your audio. I'm not able to hear you actually now.
No, can you hear me now?
Now it's better. Yeah,
Can you hear me now?
it's okay. Yeah, better.
No, if you tell me what you could not hear, I could probably go back and
The last
repeat
points
them
you
briefly.
made.
Last points were that, what I'm saying is that um, there are critical perspectives against an individualistic, positive, liberal view of the self in the West as well. And they draw upon Aristotle, the communitarian, um, sometimes on Hegel, like Taylor, sometimes on Marx. What I was saying was that, in our tradition, highly sophisticated critical thinking about the question of the self, which we should look at. We should not assimilate them either with thought and say this is essentially saying the same thing as the Marxists. That's not true. We should not also say that Indians have a perspective. Tagore and Gandhi are saying this. They are not. And I think what is good for us is that each one of them develops a conception of the self, which we should first of all try to systematize and put them in the language of social philosophy, which is our subject. And then we should we should not merely, first of all, we should state what their arguments are carefully and clearly. But we need not actually stop where they stopped with their own argument. We can try to go beyond that and explore the question of the self, more widely. Because if you look at the way the Western academia works, when somebody writes a book on Hegel, he's not simply restating what is there in Hegel. He's restating what is there in Hegel in order to think with that and go forward, right? So what I'm saying is that that is what we should try to do more systematically about our own thinker. Instead of falling into this trap of saying that there is an Indian view, rather than that, we keep the specificity of the thinking of each thinker and then try to develop those arguments.
Yeah. Thank you, Sudipta. Now it is open for discussion. So, anybody would like to start the ball rolling? Anaga, you would like to start?
Nilanjan has his
You,
hand raised.
Professor Patnaik, but if there are students to go first, I can ask my question later.
Yeah, go ahead, no problem.
Yeah. Hello. Good morning, Professor. Nice to listen to you after such a long time. So, you mentioned Bernard Williams. So, my question is in relation to the idea of internal reasons that Williams presents. And what I was wondering when you were speaking about the idea in Gandhi is, whether this whole idea of appealing to the others to other to see that this person is not a non-self is in line with what Professor Belgrami argues of being able to situate oneself in the moral psychological economy of desires and beliefs and commitments of the other. He speaks of a group, but whether it's of an individual or a group, etc. And then this tradition, so to say, of attacking the liberal individual self, that uh, and I'm concerning myself with the scholarship that comes from the location of social justice, especially caste and experience, which sort of seems to be situating itself in the second notion of the self that you traced from Tagore, which is very embedded in experience. But then that sort of also becomes limiting in transcending to the more unalienated, expansive kind of self that you present in Gandhi. So the first question is whether you do, sort of draw from that idea of internal reasons and appealing to internal reasons, and whether you also read Gandhi saying something like that. And the second question is whether this sort of new way of looking at the self in the situated orientated kind of idea of the self, and how that, do you think that restricts one from theorizing this unalienated self? Those are my two questions.
No,
Thank
I
you.
would not go into Bernard Williams very much because I think uh, beyond a point, I do not do that very often because each philosophical tradition has an internal uh, coherence and consistency. And in some cases, to say that this thinking is like that thinking is helpful, but not beyond the point. But let me touch on something which I find very interesting and difficult. It's a seriously difficult question. And I think in what you raise, uh, this problem is implicit because you mentioned caste. On the one side, um, take Gandhi's claim that because he can go and clean latrine, he has experience of the same work as the Dalits do. And therefore, he can, let us put aside the question of whether he can represent the Dalits on the basis of that. This is what he also does in the Pune Pact kind of context. But let us leave that aside because we are not discussing politics. the Tagore will not agree with that. The interesting problem which comes out of Tagore is that the very deep focus on intensity, proximity, the translatability of the other's experience, through love. That is also limited because Tagore would never say, no serious philosopher will say that somebody with whom you have a relationship of love, you can necessarily experience her experience, right? What you can is you can see the presence of an experience which is very intense, right? But we cannot transcend our experience, right? Now, that actually, um, it works very well when we are thinking of a relation, a relationship of love, because there's an implicit equality there by the very fact of the exchange of love, right? But the moment you shift it to the question of caste, it leads to a very different and I think much more difficult conclusion. That is why you will see in Tagore, both in his prose writing, but in some very beautiful poems, he reflects on this quite a lot. In fact, uh, he is also not saying that making this gesture of saying that I'm with you or I sympathize with you, which you said that we should make that kind of universal humanistic gesture. He's not opposed to it, but he is against our, overvaluing. Overvaluing in the sense, overvaluing is not the right word. He does not think that that does not have value. He thinks that we exaggerate our ability to understand the experience of somebody in that. And he says that how can I have the experience? How can I understand the experience of somebody else? You know, think of it in a different, rather dream context. The kind of argument that people have about rape. And some people would say that, how can somebody who hasn't gone through that experience understand? It depends on what you mean by understanding. If you mean by understanding experiencing the same thing, then of course others cannot. But if you mean by understanding that it's a horrendous thing for somebody to happen to somebody, then we can understand. But notice that there's a huge difference between these two uses of the term understand. And Tagore is very, very careful about not doing that. So he says, for instance, in one of his poems, which I find one of the most evocative on the question of caste, it's from Gitanjali, where he says that তোমার আসন যেথায় নামে অপমানের তলে সেথায় আমার প্রণাম নামে না. That is, your feet can go down to a point, where people exist in humiliation. My pranam cannot actually go down to that point to touch your feet. I think it's an extremely interesting and it's also a deeply troubling move, which the reason I like it is that it is that you should have that kind of universalistic humanistic position, but do not overestimate own moral position through that, because there is a there is a there's a sense in which the incommensurability of experience, because of social inequality, is something which simply uh, cannot be translated. That is something which I actually like in Tagore. But it's also not a simple solution because Tagore is not somebody who goes and cleans latrines, right? So Gandhi does. So Gandhi is also trying to get into it from a certain angle, which should be respected. But Tagore would not accept that position, that because you have done that, you have partaken of their experience. Because Tagore will probably say that social experience is a totality. And just as an anthropologist who goes and does participatory observation, in one sense, she becomes part of that society, but in another sense, she always remains not part of that society. In the politics of sympathy, there's also something like that. And I think Tagore thinks of it in a way which I find more attractive because it's more careful. It's more careful about our own limitation. And also remember one thing, that in the Indian tradition particularly, this is what I like, the discussion about morality is very often not about what we can do morally, but what we cannot do morally, but we claim credit for. The Buddhists are very good at that kind of thing. I usually give an example in the class. Let me give you that example because that would show this clearly. Once I saw a TV program here where a TV station on a very cold day got one of their women, very young women, come out and stand in the street, right? And she's obviously shivering, she doesn't have a coat, just to observe how people react. So people reacted in various ways, and most people came and said, "Go inside, you'll catch a cold, you will catch your death, etc." One woman actually came up and said, "Do you want to go somewhere? Why don't you take a cab? I'll give you money." Right? But after about a few minutes, a young black man, very young, I think 20, 22, he didn't say any word. He simply came and he took his very heavy anorak. He took it off himself and he simply wrapped it on her. He was not very eloquent. So he said, "Sister, you will die if you stand like this." So this girl, when she was wrapped with this thing, she said, "But what about you?" So he said that I work in that shop. So I'm going into that shop now, but you will die if you stand here in this cold, right? And then the crew, etc., came out, and the man who did that, he also felt a bit sheepish because he did not expect anything like that. What I tell the students is that this shows how hard it is to do a good act, right? A truly good act. But the Buddhists will say that in spite of doing this good act, I think the Buddhists would approve of this point. Even with after doing this good act, you must not feel that look at me, all these people passed by, nobody did this. I alone was the person who did this. If you do that, then you get a kind of arrogance attached to a genuinely good moral act, right? But it reduces the moral quality of what you have done because of arrogance. And remember that how central this is also to Gandhi in an indirect way, because one of Gandhi's favorite songs was Vaishnava Janato Tene Kahiye, right? And if you listen to the wording, Vaishnava Janato Tene Kahiye, ye pigra parai jane re. The first part, he puts the coat over the girl. So he knows the pigra parai, pigra parai jane re. But notice the second sentence. Paradukhe upakara kare, which he has done, toe mana abhimana nare. That is, he doesn't allow that to create a conceit in himself. That is actually the test of the fully good act. So the fully good act itself, but non-arrogant, following the fully good act makes the act good. So I think what I find interesting is that I wanted to illustrate general thinking I have. I haven't actually done it very rigorously, but I feel that there is what I find attractive is that in Indian moral thinking, there's a lot of thinking about this side, what we cannot do, rather than what we can do. And I find that reflected in both Gandhi and Tagore, but I think Tagore is careful because of this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Nilanjan and Aparna.
I have, uh, sir, I have two questions. One is somehow related to one of your earlier papers, though in a different context, where you had mentioned about Shama Songit আমার চেতনা চৈতন্য করে. So is this chetona chaitanya, where the chetona, if it means consciousness, and chaitanya means more enlightening or more leading the consciousness towards more and more of a perfection or betterment, is this also a sort of exploration of the self? And because Shama Songit has a very strong tradition in West Bengal, maybe influencing Tagore as well. This is one question. And the second question is, as sir, you have said that self is more relational, where we get to know ourselves better in understanding by in relation to others. Now, sir, then what may be the point from where this self, which is distinct but still in relation to others, just for a better understanding, uh, that line being demarcated between this self and this I and the where my self is fully merging with others. So where to make this point of distinction between this I, which is at the same time distinct but in relation to others, and something which is fully merged with others, creating a we. So, sir, these
A
are my
very
two
good question.
questions.
So let me answer briefly. Chetana Chaitanya Kore, uh, of course, it's obviously uh, going into the question of the self. I think there are three ways in which the question of the self can be explored. One is in the old religious way, which is reflected in that song, I suspect, with a lot of previous religious thought. They're essentially, but they are concerned with the same question that, what is my relationship with myself? And sometimes they would say that, you have a real awareness if you understand that there is some kind of a conscious existence in the world of which you are a part. That is the religious answer. I'm not very attracted to that answer. I respect that answer. I can see what they're trying to do, but I'm not very attracted to that. I think, to me, as somebody who is not a religious person, I would turn it into, in some ways, a non-religious, mundane activity of trying to understand myself in two ways. My own interior experiences and having a clearer and richer perception of that, and also an understanding of myself in relationship with uh, society, right? So it is very secular in a certain sense. The third position, which I find very attractive, that's why I'm so interested in Tagore. What Tagore is able to do is to sometimes take the language of older religion, but he evacuates the older religious content of the term, and he does a form of thinking which still remains very religious, right? But which is not religious in the old sense. Take the example that I gave you from that song. আমার চরণ যেথায় নামে অপমানের তলে, তোমার চরণ যেথায় নামে অপমানের তলে, সেথায় আমার প্রণাম নামে না. Right? Now, I have thought about it very, very often because, for instance, Gopal Guru, who is my former student in JNU, we have discussed this endlessly. And I tell Gopal sometimes that, I try to make sense of my relationship with you in a certain way. But I think my language of thinking is more impoverished, than Tagore's language. Simply because Tagore can posit a notion of God, and therefore pranam, right? For me, the problem would be if I do not believe in God, how can I do pranam, right? But to say that your feet go down to a point where my pranam does not reach, right, is able to communicate a certain sense, of moral difficulty, that I can see the existence of something which is profoundly troubling and abhorrent. I want to show that I'm disturbed by that. I do not want to take part in that, right? But I think my language allows me to do it in a way which is, I acknowledge, is more impoverished than the language that Tagore has. Because I think Tagore's language, Tagore's use of that language, is not committed to the belief in an afterlife. The presence of God is very important for him, right? But in an afterlife, Janmantar, Karma Phal, etc., it's completely separated from that. And secondly, your second question, the deep question, very difficult question. I do not think I have the clear answer. Um, Implicit in what I said about identity, there is a potential for an answer because each one of these attributes, not each one, many of the attributes that I have are collective attributes in the sense that you know when I say that I'm a Hindu or a Muslim, I can say that because there's a community which is Muslim, right, which pre-exists me, to which I can refer, right, from which I draw a particular characteristic for myself. So many of these attributes are attributes that are collective. But it raises many, many difficult questions. Some of those attributes can themselves become oppressive. They have internal power structures. So what do I do to somebody who says that if you're a Muslim, this is how you should be a Muslim? And I do not agree with that. So there are many, many different problems. But let me uh, tell you about a problem that I'm thinking about now, which seems to me to be one of the most profound. K.C. Bhattacharya said somewhere, I've not been able to go through it very deeply, but I have conversations with Arindam Chakrabarti about it. But I think the idea itself is so striking and powerful. He said somewhere, at least that's what I gathered, that we have an excessively simplistic understanding of the shift from I to we, because they're both, uh, first person, singular and plural. So it seems that if we simply pluralize the I, then we reach the we. But he points to something which I think is very profound. He says, how can I pluralize the I? The subjective qualities of the I, the subjective meaning, the way I feel my feeling, right? The way I feel my physical experience, like pain, right? How can we pluralize that, right? So what we value about the I is this intense subjectivity. But if the intense subjectivity is what we value about the I, it's very difficult, impossible to just casually shift it to the we, right? So that's why he said that we haven't done enough thinking about the shift from the singular to the plural, the philosophical shift from the singular to the plural. I do not think I have come across a big literature about this. I'm deeply thinking about this question now because I think it's a really profound question. But remember that it's a negative question. Philosophy moves forward by objection, negative thinking, and then overcoming that by a positive resolution. I think I haven't read the book carefully enough to say that there is no resolution from his side, but it seems to me that it's negative point
question is, when it comes to Gandhi, I was wondering that even as he is somebody who has experimented a lot with the idea of restraint, um, when it comes to engaging with others, his emphasis of self seems to be more on the relation than in Tagore. Is that the case? Is something I would like to.
Um, I do not know if I have uh, entirely got your point, but let me try. Um, I think you also touched on something which is a very deep question. Particularly because you started out with the point that I made about uh, argumentative comportment.
Yeah.
That I argue with you. I think argumentation is a strange activity in some ways, and it imposes, to some extent, contradictory demands on us. Because if I engage with you in an argument, on the one side, there is an enjoyment of, or there is a rule of what Foucault and others drawing from the Greeks would say parrhesia. That is, you should be completely truthful, honest. So if I suppose Arun and I are having an argument, meaning we are having a difference about Gramsci, and I think Arun is wrong in thinking about something, right? Argumentative ethics demand that I should tell him that I disagree with him, and I should not dissemble. I should not reduce the level of disagreement, right? But then there's also another very interesting aspect of argumentation. Is argumentation part of a conversation?
Yeah.
Gadamer has interesting things to say about this. Is it part of a conversation? Conversation means the equal possibility of conversion on both sides, right? That argumentation means that we have opened this dialogue with the possibility that I might convince Arun that he is wrong, or he might convince me that I'm wrong. Right? And then that would mean that both of us would go to a place, argumentatively, philosophically, which is better than the place that we occupied distinctly before we started the argumentation as conversation. Right? Now, if you do that, then when I tell Arun that you are wrong, you are really wrong, right? The tone, or what I'm calling here the comportment, is very important. Because if my tone is very negative, right, then we would not continue the argument beyond the point. What would happen is that he would be forced essentially to reflex position of self-defense, right? And I would be forced again into a reflex position of self-defense. And that would create a situation where we might actually lead to be embittered with each other, right? Conversation means that we do not hide the disagreement, but we do the disagreement. Doing is very important. We do the disagreement consciously with self-restraint in that sense, right? Um, in a way where I tell the other that I'm doing this argument with you precisely because I have great faith in your intelligence. Otherwise I wouldn't have taken the trouble. I would not have listened to you. And listening to you immediately implies the possibility that I might be wrong myself. Right? But argumentation is also used in other contexts. And in some other contexts, conversation might not actually be the real purpose of argumentation. Argumentation can actually be the undermining of the other position. Right? But Gandhi, also Tigor probably will say, I sometimes think of it this way. Suppose, let me take up an example about the United States to make this point. Suppose I'm actually talking to somebody who is a Trump supporter, very dedicated Trump supporter. they would say that you can get into an argument in a way where ultimately your position remains what it is, and his position also remains what it is. If anything, it becomes hardened, right? They would say, do you think that that was actually a very good activity? What did it achieve? But if you carry on the conversation in a way where it is always possible that he would not agree with you, but at least he doesn't feel insulted,
Yeah.
and I do not feel insulted, right? Then there's a possibility that because I believe that I'm right and he is wrong, that I might be able to sow a seed of doubt in his mind about the correctness of his view.
Yeah.
So they would therefore say that even when you are getting into a political dialogue or a political debate, not a dialogue, but political debate, I'm debating with somebody who is, let's say, in my case, individually, a BJP supporter, right? Or I'm debating with somebody who is a strong, conventional liberal individual in social theory, or a Trump Republican. Yeah. They would say that even there, I think restraint is important. And some people would make an argument about restraint in a different way, which is not an argument about restraint, it's an argument. It's an argument about anger. Uh, they would say that if you lose restraint over yourself, then you tend to perform worse in an argumentative situation. But that's a separate question. So the question of restraint, and the value of restraint in this kind of discussion, very important. And I think if you read the exchanges between Tagore and Gandhi, that is really exemplary. Because the sharpness of the discussion and not fudging the difference, pushing the difference sometimes to an extreme point of clarity, right? But also doing it in a way where uh, you show respect to the other, not formally, simply by saying Gurudev or Mahatma, not like that, but in the, uh, in a certain sense, if you put it that way, the comportment of the words themselves, the way the words move, there is a genuine sense of respect to the other. That I think is very important, very, very important. And it's very important for both of them.
If I may ask a follow-up question quickly. So you were also talking about Tagore's understanding about the incommensurability of spaces. So even in that, I was wondering if is the responsibility on myself to understand that the experiences cannot be the same. Whereas in Gandhi, he seems to be emphasizing more on the possibility of establishing a relation. So is there a difference in the kind of responsibility that they each attribute to the self?
No, I think, you have to be clear about two things. Then I think this would become clearer for us. One is the claim that I can understand what you feel. The other one is to say, I cannot understand what you feel.
Okay.
But still, let us set up a relationship of this kind, right? I can never understand what you feel. When you are humiliated in terms of caste, through caste, right? But that does not mean that I do not understand that you are humiliated,
Yeah.
right? I can understand that you are humiliated and you're badly humiliated. It's very bad to feel like that, right? But I do not make the claim that I can feel what you feel.
Okay.
Right? So in both cases, you can set up a relationship, with the person who is feeling that humiliation. But there would be a difference between the kind of relation that you claim to establish with them. I like the one where you say from the start that I cannot feel what you feel. And it's also it's also reflected in a certain sense in the example of love itself.
Mhm.
Because most people would say that the whole philosophical point of teaching love in either the Vaishnava tradition or in the more modern tradition is the incommensurability of the experience between uh, the two people, men and women, right? But in spite of that, there's an obviousness to the quality of the experience to both of them. So in Tagore, I think there's a greater emphasis on the incommensurable.
Mm. Yeah.
But remember, the incommensurability does not mean that you do not value the
Yeah.
experience or the relationship which produces that experience.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm.
So I think that's a very important point, that whether you go and say that I feel what you feel, or you start from the premise that I cannot feel what you feel, but I can see that what you feel is horrendous. I personally feel attracted to the second position because otherwise, I think it's linked to this question of conceit. I'll give you an example of something that troubles me sometimes. I have lots and lots of friends who are very concerned, let's say, about the Palestinian question or any of these questions of great, um, atrocity in the world. The world is not short of these. These are going on all the time, and people get uh, really exercised by that, and some people are truly exercised by that. But sometimes when people say that, I feel the anguish of the mother whose son has been killed, right? I do not want to take that kind of position because I want to respect the point that, nobody can feel the anguish of the mother. But that does not stop me from understanding that the mother feels anguish, right? These are two different positions. So I think it's very important for me to understand what, uh, in what I can be with them and in what I cannot be with them. So I think what I usually tell the students in teaching is that, think of these incidents like uh, a, dropping a pebble in the water. This is how the Kashmiris would also sometimes discuss some of these questions. If somebody throws a pebble into the water, and then you have ripples going out in concentric circles. So think of an event like that, and do not claim to be at the at the point, at the point at the center.
Okay.
Judge clearly whether you are at the second circle or the third circle or the fourth circle. I'm not a Palestinian. Right? I have many students who are Palestinian. There's some people who come from Palestine, some people who are Palestinians but who are Canadians or Americans, right? But they are of Palestinian origin. So I usually tell them that, if you think of the mother at the at, at the point, at the central point, then people who are her family would be the next circle. Then people who are Palestinians would be the next circle. Then people who are Palestinians but live abroad would be the next circle. And there's no way I can claim to be in any of those, right? So I must actually see the circle in which I am placed in order to be able to relate to that incident or to be able to relate to those that group of people. So what I'm suggesting to you is that, you said that how we are related. What I'm suggesting is that we must also have a more careful refinement and differentiation of that word relation.
Yes.
All these people are related, but not related in exactly the same way.
Mm.
But Gandhi and Tagore, the good thing about reading them is that though none of them discusses this question, both of them actually sharpen our mind to think about these things, more clearly.
Thank you so.
Mangesh, you like to ask questions? Mangesh.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah,
Arun, can you hear me? Hello?
give me just a second. You give me a second. I'll come back in a minute. Right?
Yeah, okay.
But Arun, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. No.
Yeah.
Sir, can I ask the next question?
Yeah, yeah. Raja, okay, fine. No.
Sir, will he be back since my internet was
He'll be
lost?
back, yeah, yeah. How is situation in Pune, Mangesh? Better?
You mean COVID?
COVID
COVID
situation,
situation?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it's much better now than what it was a few weeks ago. And the educational institutions remain closed. I mean, in the sense that there are no offline classes happening, but we of course have online classes and administration in the university. For example, I work from my office, and so that way the university is fully functioning. Only the students are not here.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yes, come, yeah. Mangesh, you go ahead, yeah.
Yeah.
Since the question of love came up, I think in the discussion as a platform there can be a dialogue between selves. So I was just thinking that the idea of friendship, which has played a very important role in Western political thought, which is akin to love, but it's different, and it has also had in Western thought a very clear sort of a political dimension. I think friendship has been theorized there from Aristotle through Cicero, then Montaigne and Simone Weil and beyond. And so Derrida, in fact, not so long ago. Do we have here in the Indian tradition or traditions resources of that kind? I know Bhikkhubai has written something on this that I have seen on the notion of friendship in Indic thought. But do you have any reflections on this?
I remember that because, when Bhikkhu was writing it, we had a conversation about the different examples of friendship in Indian literature. I'm not very well read on the philosophical side of the Indian tradition, so I cannot say. There must be discussions about friendship, more abstract discussions about the topic of friendship in philosophical thought. I'm not very well read on that. I remember discussing with Bhikkhu examples from literature like Arjuna and Krishna. I think in the Mahabharata, one example which I think is even more interesting is the relationship between Arjuna and Krishna and Draupadi. Very, 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 very interesting. And other instances. I personally feel that in our tradition, the only thing that I can tell you out of my reading is that Prem in Indian thought has two meanings always. One is a more generic meaning of prem, and the other one is a much more specific meaning of prem between a man and a woman. But if you think of the Vaishnavas, for instance, what I find very interesting is their idea that prem exists in Vrindavan in at least 4 or 5 different ways. It exists in the relationship between the. Okay, just a second. I'll give you an example. There's a song by, I think it's a Marathi poet, Padmananda Das. It's used to be sung by Pandit Jasraj. It says, Kaha karu Vaikuntha mein jaye. I don't want to go to paradise. Jahan nahi Yashoda, yahan nahi Nanda, yahan nahi Yashoda. That is parental relation. Yahan nahi Gopi, that is lover's relation. Gwalana Gai, that is the other cowherd and the cattle. And then it says, Jahan nahi Jal Jamuna ke Niramala, jahan nahi Karamba ke chai. So I think prem is instantiated in 4 or 5 different ways, because all these are categories of prem. One is Vatsalya, between Nanda, Yashoda, and Krishna. Gopis, of course, that's the most obvious. But friendship between Krishna and his cowherd friends is also an important constituent. And then Krishna, Krishna's relationship of love with the cattle. And in the Bhagavad, there is a very interesting incident where Brahma comes and hides the cattle. He takes the cattle away. And Krishna, with his Maya, he creates the cattle again and brings them back to, back to Gokul. So he has a relationship with the cattle, which is one of love. And he has a relationship of love with the water of the Yamuna and also the Kadamba. So non-human nature. So prem covers that, but I haven't actually come across the kind of deep reflexive exploration of the concept of friendship that we get in the Western tradition. But it may be because of my lack of knowledge. Somebody like Arindam Chakravarti or Jonathan Kaneri, or somebody who is more into this kind of philosophy. And the Buddhists might again have interesting things to say, because they are, they have the institution of the Sangha, and they have a monastic life. And monastic life creates a relationship of friendship between people who have given up their family, but they have now created new kind of relationship with male companions in a monastery. And that relationship must be partly the relationship of friendship. But I know just nothing about that.
Thank you.
Raja,
Thank you so much.
Raja, I would like to ask a question.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, it's so good to ask the question from you, Professor. So I last listened to you in Jamia in 2019. Yeah. So, like, I had a question. Say, for you said that there is a relation between the Sufis say that they have a relation between relation with Tagore. So, if so, taking Tagore and the Sufis as the other selves, as like the Sufi are the one self and the Tagore are the other self, and if anyone is trying to draw similarities between the two, can there can there can there be intercultural inter self knowledge production, and how would that happen?
That's a very good question. I don't think I have come across very much, but I can give you a very good short answer. Not because It's not my answer. It's an answer I steal from one of my students. Um, I have a student who did a master's dissertation, which was on the question of time in Sufi thinking, in Islamic thinking, but essentially Sufi thinking. So he spoke about three notions of time. One is a pre-Islamic notion of time, which is very much like seem to me like the Hindu conception of time as Kal or Mahakal, whose effect on the world is destructive. Everything decays, everything is destroyed by Kal. The second is time in the ordinary sense, the passing of time and how things change. But he focused on the Sufi notion of waqt in Arabic also, which is the notion of a moment, the moment of illumination, where the Sufi experiences oneness with God. And when I was examining his dissertation in the exam interview, I gave him an example from a Tagore poem, and he was quite surprised by that. He said that because his thesis was mainly based on Sufi poetry, and he said that my poets are also essentially expressing the same thing. Tagore has a poem which says, "Maje maje tobo dekha pai, chirodin keno pai na." That is, why is it that I see you uh, at points of time, but not all the time? And then he uses a metaphor. He says, "Keno megh ashe hridoyo akashe tomare dekhite deয় না." That is, why is it that sometimes clouds cover the sky of my mind and obscures you? And so in Tagore also you have this, conception of a work that is some points where we transcend ourselves and we can be in touch with God, but it's very difficult to hold on to that. And sadhana, that is either you see it as a religious cultivation or poetic self-cultivation, is essentially to try to elongate those moments. I'm surprised that we do not have more work on Indian Sufi thought, and I'm also surprised that maybe that there is, but I do not know that it is. For instance, Bangladeshi scholars, they should also work on this kind of thinking. Bangladeshi Islam or Baul thought. We have a very big figure uh, in Bengali thinking, Lalan Fakir, whose whose poetry is very popular, but some associates of Tagore also tried to put them together, and I do not see enough work on those things, either in India or in Bangladesh.
So the
My
second,
own attitude is, in fact, this is something that I discuss with Bangladeshi students who come to me here. Some of them, show a discontent against the way Islamic thought is taught in big Western universities, which is very similar to the discontent that was shown by uh, English literature professors. When they said that English literature meant essentially Shakespeare and Milton and Wordsworth, etc., and nothing else. And English literature has been changed in big universities completely. And one of my Bangladeshi students said that, when I went to an Islamic thought course, it seemed that, there's no Islamic thinking anywhere else except mainly in the Arab world and also to some extent in the Persian world. So he said that I felt completely unrepresented in that. So I told him that, look, it's your responsibility uh, to do work and show what is valuable about the work of Indian Islam.
okay. So I had two questions. So the final question is, say for example, there is this one self of mine which is situated in this time, and now I'm a student. But say for example 30 years after now, I'll become a thief. So when I'll become a thief after 30 years. So how shall I perceive this self, which is a student of at 21, and rather than like what will become of this? How shall I put it? Will this be a self, or will that be a other, or a self in the other self?
There's a lot of discussion about that in Christian thought, but it is the other way around. You said that now I'm a student, I can become a thief. They do it the other way around. For instance, Saint Augustine, uh, he discusses the other way around, that he fell into bad company of children who were thieves, and then how he gradually comes out of it. The literature which deals with things like this is the analytical literature that I mentioned. There's a lot of writing about that. If you read the work of Derek Parfit and to some extent also Bernard Williams, they have thought a lot about
So who?
uh, Derek Parfit, Derek Parfit, and Bernard Williams. There's a lot of discussion about later selves. If you're going to go and Google the philosophical literature on the later self, uh, you will get a lot of it.
Thank you, Professor.
Any question? And last question? You can take one more question and close. Anybody would like to ask?
Yes, sir.
Oh, Gatil, yeah.
Sir, when you say that the self, it is more of a relation, and in terms of Gandhi, he extended this relation to animals also. So when he extends this argument to animals, then there arises a contradiction in his own sayings, where he says that even my actions are they are. They my actions are they are derived or derived my actions are derived by my spirit rather than my mind. So I mean this is a contradiction in itself. You see, when he says that the self whole, he includes even animals in that, but in his own self he feels a contradiction that his spirit is the driver of his actions. Can you talk?
I could not understand your question clearly.
So, so you see, what Gandhi says about self, we don't have much material on that. But when he talks about, he mentions the words like endeavor, spirit, conscience, or inner voice. So he says that like sometimes this is the my inner voice that drives my actions, but on the other side, like I don't have control over the spirit. He says that I do not claim to know definitely that all actions, all conscious thought and action on my part is directed by the spirit. But on an examination of the greatest steps that I have taken in my life, as also of those that may be regarded as the least, I think it will not be improper to say that all of them were directed by the spirit. So, like,
Directed by the spirit.
yes, sir, this is divided with the conscience,
Hmm.
inner voice that he
Yeah.
gives to him.
Yeah.
So that that is the question. Like,
I'm not always very comfortable with that argument in Gandhi. What you should do is, I think there's a very interesting discussion between Tigor and Gandhi on the Bihar earthquake. And you will get it in a book which is called The Mahatma and the Poet, edited by Sabyasachi Bhattacharya. It came out of the National Book Trust, so it must be part of your university library. Look at that, because there Tagore and Gandhi are debating precisely this. Gandhi says that it's a chastisement for the practice of untouchability, and Tagore says, how can that be? Because how can you think of a God who is just and who indiscriminately punishes people through something like an earthquake? And Gandhi then writes a couple of pieces to explain what he means by his inner voice. So he thinks, for instance, there's a very big difference between Gandhi and Tagore. Gandhi thinks, and he says several times, that not a leaf turns in a tree without his will. You know, Tagore is the deist. Tagore believes, on the contrary, that God does not actually control everything like that. God has created a universe which has its own laws. God does not interfere in that universe. And science is humanity's attempt to explore that universe for what it is. So Tagore is deeply respectful to science because of this. Gandhi does not have that kind of respect for modern science, right? And I'm not very, I'm not entirely convinced by Gandhi's arguments of the inner voice, because I see that inner voice is very powerful in directing my actions. So if I feel that I'm doing something uh, where the instruction has come from God, then of course it would give me a kind of commitment to that act, which I would not have otherwise. But I also see an attendant problem with that, which is that if I act on the basis of my inner voice, then what about the conviction or inner voices of others? If that happens to be different from mine, how do we resolve that? So I'm not totally convinced by the inner voice argument. Yeah, I think Unnati had a question. She said
Right.
that.
No,
Had
yeah, please go ahead. This is last
Yes, sir.
question. Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking. Yeah, thank you so much for taking my question. Thank you for the lecture. So, I wanted to ask that you mentioned the two different lines of thought between one saying that I can understand what you feel, and the other saying I cannot understand what you feel, but I can see that it is horrible and horrendous and all that. I wanted to ask that if we were to categorize these, as let's say, between empathy and sympathy or different versions of empathy, which would it be? Like, will they be seen as different versions of empathy, or as one being empathy and one being sympathy? And like, I wanted to understand more about what Tagore's idea would be on the concept of empathy. Does he think that you can only empathize with someone when you've experienced what they have experienced, or can you still understand, empathize with them even when you haven't experienced what they have experienced? That.
That is again, I think it's a very deep question, and it's a question about which Western thinkers have also thought. I did not mention that because I was talking about Tigor and Gandhi. But if you look at Adam Smith, he has a great book called Theory of Moral Sentiment, and you will see that Adam Smith says that God has created man in a way where we cannot have the experience of others. So even somebody who is closest to me, my wife or my son or my daughter, if they step on a thorn and feel pain, there's no way I can feel that pain, right? And Adam Smith will say that you should not actually beat yourself up for that. It's not your fault. It's not a moral fault that you cannot feel somebody else's pain. You are ontologically made like that, right? But don't forget that God has placed something else in you, which he called sympathy. This is his use of the word sympathy, uh, which is sympathy, which is reflected in the fact that we have a pre-reflexive response to other people's difficulty. So suppose Arun and I are walking on the street in New York and we are talking, and he simply stumbles, right? His foot gets caught in a flagstone and he stumbles. And I would immediately, I or you, whoever is walking with him, would immediately sort of stretch his hand to stop him from falling. What is remarkable about this in Adam Smith's view is that it is not something that I'm doing by thinking. I haven't had time to think. I, it doesn't happen this way that, I first empirically observe and tell myself that I think Arun is falling. What should I do in this situation? And then my conscience says that you should try to break his fall and stretch your arm. And then I stretch my arm. There's simply no time to do that. right?
Mm.
So the fact that I stretch my arm to break his fall shows that there's a pre-reflexive, that is, it's a pre-intellectual instinct in human mind, in human character. Now, that question, I'm glad that you see the difference. That seems to me to be the crucial point. Whether you say that I understand in the full sense what you feel, or you say I understand in the second sense, that I do not understand, I do not understand your experience. I cannot do that. But I can understand that what you are going through is horrible, right? Which a man can, which not merely a woman can say to another woman who has been raped, right? It's also something that a man can say
Mm.
to somebody who has been raped,
Mm.
just as a man can say to somebody who has been beaten up quite badly, right? So it doesn't matter what you do semantically. You can say that all that you should do is you should conventionalize for your own writing. If you're writing a paper, you should say, in this paper, I would use the term sympathy for the first, or empathy for the first, and sympathy for the second. So analytical philosophers will say that simply say that we can see that the term understand is being used in two meanings. And we call it understand one and understand two, right? Or understand A and understand B, so that the content of the concept is not confused. And then you can take your pick. In fact, you can say that I would call understanding one sympathy or empathy, and the other one sympathy, or something like that. You can also adjectivize. You can think on often putting an adjective in front of empathy or sympathy and then do it. So that doesn't matter. The thing is that you should do it clearly and consistently. But the important question is to hold the conceptual distinction clearly. Because I personally feel that otherwise, this is something that troubles me about India and also about the West. Wherever there is a liberal culture, I'm actually troubled by a certain kind of moral arrogance in liberal and left kind of politics. That is simply because I see a person being killed on the television, and I am exercised. Some people will say that how can you say that you are troubled by that? Because you are watching television, and just 2 minutes back there was an advertisement for a car, and 10 minutes after that there would be an advertisement for a chocolate, and you would also watch that. And in the middle, there's a news segment where a Palestinian boy is shot, right? So it is all the same to you. So you have a completely spectatorial, in a bad sense, spectatorial, uninvolved relationship with something that is going on in the TV screen. So these are just three TV screens to you. I do not think that is right either. That I think is an extremely cynical perspective. Very important for us to uh, relate to the world with commitment, right? But at the same time, I'm also quite opposed to a certain kind of left liberal idea that simply, think of something like uh, what happens here. I'm thinking of writing a paper on that. How can I say that because I live in this society, I'm also a colored person. I'm not a white American. I'm not an American, and I'm not white, right? But uh, I was saying this in a lecture. Very famous American black actor who went into a shop where I buy my bread every week. He was actually accused by somebody or suspected by somebody of shoplifting. So this became a very big incident. But the shop apologized to him later on. But the thing is that he goes into the shop and he's suspected. I go into the shop. I'm also a colored person, right? I do not look like a white American, but I'm not suspected. I go there as if like any other professor in Columbia University. I'm treated like that, right? So the thing is that I should not pretend that I understand what he goes through. But I'm not pretending when I say that, what you are going through is horrible. And I should try to do something about it. That's why for me, that metaphor of drawing circles around a particular incident and then trying to place yourself in the proper circle is very important. Because if you are in the fourth, but you claim to be in the second, I think you show moral arrogance. If you're in the fourth, but you feel that you are in the eighth, right, then you show moral indifference. Both of these are wrong. So this is not a mathematical calculation, but you understand what I mean. And you cannot have this kind of a more, in my view, more refined thinking about our sympathy for the suffering of others. If we do not make that initial distinction between understanding one and two. This is true of Black experience here, this is true of Dalit experience in India. And this is true of women's experience. So anywhere you have this kind of instance, of cruelty toward human beings by other human beings, immediately I think this question is raised. Whether you are a deeply political person or not. You don't have to be a political person in a narrow sense, because your humanity is affected by this in some way or the other. This is what Tigor and Gandhi would say, and we should take that seriously. All serious thinkers would say that, and we should take that seriously. But we should think on our own. That is my urging to all, particularly young people like you. Very important to learn from wherever you can. Doesn't matter whether Western thinker, Indian thinker, doesn't matter at all. Learn from wherever you can. But learning does not mean that you submit yourself to somebody else's thinking. Learning always means that you turn that into a raw material for your own thinking.
True. Thank you, Sudipta. Now, may I request Santosh to give vote of thanks? Santosh is my class. No? He's one of my students.
Okay.
Thank you, sir, for giving me chance to propose vote of thanks to one of most popular intellectual, and we have been getting his writings for our course since our BA course. And I'd like to thank Professor Kaviraj on behalf of my class and Arun Patnaik sir, who took care to give us a lecture on self and all the self during a time when the self, sociality, and other is very much important. So thank you very much. The talk was very much invigorating, and the insights were new to us. So thank you again on behalf of our class and those present here.
Thank you, Santosh. So, thank you, Sudipta. It's a stimulating talk as well. So bye. See you.
All right. Bye-bye.